Yeah, I guess I should start. So yeah, this is the presentation, the topic of the presentation I'll be talking about today. So I'll start with talking a little bit about myself. I'm a senior PhD student in the Department of Informatics at King's College London. To be honest, there's no such thing as a senior PhD student. It's just that if you've been doing this for like 3 years now, you just need something to add to your title. Otherwise, you just end up feeling like you're doing the same thing, being the same thing for more than 3 years. So I'm not a doctor, I'm just a PhD student, and yeah, that's it. I'm a member of the Agents and Intelligence Systems group, and I'm supervised by Dr. Sanjay Module, Elizabeth Black, and Peter McBurney. And this slide is not there just to inform you of my supervisors, but also of my drawing skills. You're supposed to be going like, oh, that's cool. Anyway. Yes, more about me. I was born, seriously, I'm not going to go into that now. Just joking. I'm going to start with a presentation overview. I'm going to cover some things that are necessary for you to understand the nature of my work. Go into the background a little bit, talk about the problem description. Then I'll explain my contribution, the proposed methodology we came up with my supervisors. I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Then explain the complexity of the solution that we will be proposing. We'll talk a little bit about what Monte Carlo simulations are and how I'm using them in my work, and as well about experiments that we have run and the results we got. So, background. I'm told by Claudia that you must have received a presentation on argumentation theory some weeks ago. I don't know if the same audience has attended that talk back then, yes or not. Anyway, I'm just going to go through some basic stuff. Let me start with saying that my work deals with the notion of strategizing in argument-based dialogue systems. Okay, you don't have to know much about these things other than that in such systems, the important aspect that characterizes them is that they formalize how participants exchange locutions. You can assume that locutions are something like arguments. Okay, we exchange in dialogues. And these systems define how these arguments are exchanged. And of course, in a dialogue, you have some sort of a dialogical objective. For example, in a persuasion dialogue, you want to persuade someone to accept your point of view. So in such systems, dialogues are perceived as games. They're actually games. You're trying to win against someone. And we have a protocol that defines the set of possible arguments that you can move at any point. Can I move this argument against my opponent? Against something that he said? Can I not? And why? And when? These kind of things, I repeat something I've said before. These kind of things are part of the protocol that defines how the dialogue evolves. And the strategy problem, which is the problem I'm concerned with, has to do with choosing a move out of that set. What's the proper move to move at a specific point that will increase my chances of winning the game? Okay? Now, a little bit about argumentation systems. I'm not going to go dig into this thing now. I'm just going to say a couple of things about what logics are and what an argumentation system is. Just abstractly, you need to understand a couple of things that are kind of basic. For example, that logics is a science that studies how we reason. Okay? And essentially, argumentation systems are an abstraction of logics because they allow you to investigate this reasoning from a high level, one that does not really require that you understand exactly what's going on underneath. Essentially, I'll give you a simple example. Assume that we have something like this. This is like, we've got some logical constituents, a premise, for example, which is a fact. This could be, this P now, could be something like, Tweety is a bird, okay? And this logical inference could be something like, birds fly, okay? At the same time, you could have something like, Tweety is a penguin, and penguins do not fly, okay? In these two cases, we've got two different conclusions. In this case, we conclude that Tweety can fly, and in this case, we can conclude that Tweety cannot fly, okay? Now, based on how argumentation theory works, you would convert these two sentences into two simple nodes, and given that they have a conflicting relationship, you can assume that they attack each other. Okay? So you can convert your knowledge, the things that you know, you can actually convert that thing into a graph, with a directed graph with the tight relationships between the arguments. Okay? That's all you need to know. Essentially, what I'm dealing with is how we move these arguments in a dialogue game. Every participant essentially moves one of these nodes in a dialogue game against another move that is already part of the game. For example, assume that I'm going to have a dialogue with my supervisor, Sanjay, that's me, and I'm going to talk about the Tweety problem, okay? I'm just going to say A, Sanjay's going to move B against me. Now the protocol can define can decide on whether A might be repeated against B, or whether it cannot be repeated against B. These are stuff that are defined by the protocol and which you need to not worry about. But this is the idea of how a dialogue may evolve. Okay? Now, opponent modeling. That's where my work comes in. As you can understand, when you go against someone in a dialogue, and if you want to strategize against them, then you need to rely on some information. You have to know something about them. If you know nothing about them, then you cannot really strategize. If I, for example, don't know anything about Sanjay, and I go against him for the first time, then I cannot strategize at all. I cannot simulate the possible ways based on which a dialogue would evolve, because I have no information about what he knows and what he could use against me. I can only assume that he knows some things. And if I have come across Sanjay in the past, then I can rely on my experience and on the arguments that he has used against me in the past to form something like a model of his possible knowledge. So based on the things that I've already described, you can understand that I can have my own knowledge base, which can be understood as an abstract argumentation graph. Okay? This is all the things I know, and these are the attack relationships between the things I know. Okay? At the same time, I can have an assumption of what is Sanjay's knowledge in the same representation as an abstract argumentation graph. These arguments are arguments I've come across when interacting with Sanjay in dialogues, and obviously I am aware of these attack relationships between them as well. As you can understand, between these two sets, there might exist some attack relationships. And if I know some stuff about Sanjay, I can then strategize in what sense? Assume, for example, that a dialogue is supposed to take place about an argument A. I can assume that Sanjay can counter that A with B, and I can counter that B with these two arguments, C and E. Yes?
So the attacks you have in Sanjay's knowledge base, they are exactly, they are based on the same structure as in your knowledge. So,
yes.
you only assume that the knowledge he has is different, but
exactly.
how arguments are constructed and how they attack each other is still the same. You don't
it's
assume
exactly
that
the same, yeah.
So you assume you both
you
have
can
the same
assume that there are some
mechanism.
conflicting relationships between those arguments,
Yeah.
based on the example that I gave you at the beginning with Tweety.
Yeah,
okay?
but so you use the same reasoning process. You don't
exactly.
use
I use the same reasoning process in order to decide whether there exist attack relationships between Sanjay's arguments. Okay? Now, for strategizing, given what I believe Sanjay believes, and given what I know about myself, I can assume that if I go into a dialogue about the acceptability of A, trying to persuade Sanjay to accept that A is a valid argument, it's something that he should believe, I can assume that the dialogue would evolve in this way. Me saying A, Sanjay responding with saying B against A, me having two possible options, either E or C, and Sanjay being able to counter just one of them, C. So obviously in this case, the best choice when I reach this strategic point here, when I'm presented with two options, would be to go with E. Especially assuming that backtracking is not allowed, that you cannot go back to a previous point and change the argument that you've used at that point. So
can I just ask them?
Of course.
So Sanjay, what was I saying? So if he didn't use argument B, does that mean you should disregard what your knowledge base?
If he didn't use argument B, then that would mean that my assumption, and obviously you mean that he would have used a different argument. That just implies that my modeling is not perfect. It implies that I lack knowledge about what he knows. And obviously this is something that I have to account for. And that's where my work comes in. So that's a very good question.
So it's like a forward modeling. You always simulate what's
I'm trying to
going
predict what's going to happen. In a sense.
But isn't it slow? It depends how much knowledge you have to
Well, it depends actually on your experience. If I've entered into 1,000 dialogues with Sanjay, then it's most likely that I know all the things that he knows. Isn't it? Most of the things that he knows. So, or not, yes. But to some extent, you are going to have a much more credible assumption about what he knows. So, how do we build an opponent model? Well, that's exactly what you were talking about. As an actual dialogue takes place, this is not a simulation, this is an actual dialogue, okay? I might come across an argument that I wasn't aware of, Sanjay knowing. In this case, I've lost the dialogue because I'm not the one speaking last, okay? So, nevertheless, I've gained new information. I found out that Sanjay knows another argument, argument D, which I wasn't aware of, and I included in my opponent model. So now I know that Sanjay knows D as well, and next time I come across Sanjay, I'm going to be able to account for the fact that he also knows D. Of course, this is very trivial, and we do it in our everyday life as well, so you should be able to understand this. Another way of finding out what other people might know is someone letting you know that, for example, if I'm going to go against Claudia in a dialogue and I want to know stuff about Claudia and no one, and I know nothing about her, maybe Nick will approach me and say to me, you know what, Claudia knows this, and this, so when you come across her in a dialogue, be sure to avoid using this, and this argument. Now, of course, various issues arise in this case, trust issues. I mean, to what extent should I trust Nick? I mean, I've never seen him before in my life, and I don't know whether I should trust him or not. There's lots of work on how to reason about trust, and Yuking Kang, forgive my accent, Kai, and Simon Parsons have made a lot of work on this topic. It's an interesting paper. Reading about this is very good, especially if you're doing something like, if you're interested in my topic. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about another way of incorporating information into your opponent model. Okay, that's another way. So, is this all we can do? Is there anything else that we could do? So, my response to this question is yes. And I actually came up with this idea halfway through my PhD, especially at a time where things were getting really, really rough. When you start your PhD, you should know that the first 1.5 years, well, it's kind of easy because you've got your supervisor, they're going to tell you what you need to do exactly, but at some point, it's up to you to come up with new ideas and implement them and run experiments and get papers out there. And at that point, I was able to come up with this. And here's what it is about. That's just supposed to be funny. I'm going to give you the intuition. And I'm going to start with explaining a chess game. How many of you know how to play chess? Okay, all of you know how to play chess. You don't know how to play chess. Okay, you could leave the presentation if you want, because I don't want to. So yeah, it's a very simple game. It's not a simple game, but it's a game that everyone knows. I'm really sorry that I've chosen this game. The next example is going to be a lot easier to follow. Are you aware of the 5 moves checkmate? It goes like this. So assume that I'm the black agent, okay, black player, and the blue player. The blue player is an expert, the black player is a newbie. Okay? It's the first time he's playing chess. The white player is moving the pawn over there. The black player responds with this one. Bishop is out, this position. This guy doesn't even have a clue about what's going to happen. He's moving the horse. You've got the queen now taking that position over there. Another pawn is moved by the black agent, and he loses the game with a checkmate. As you can see, the king cannot go anywhere. There's no way to counter this move, and he's lost the game. So this newbie now is going to play against another guy. Another agent, agent 3. Game begins. This guy is going to repeat the same pattern of moves. This guy has no idea what's going on yet. He still doesn't pick it up. He's moving the same pawn. But he's kind of starting to wonder now that something might be going on because he sees the bishop at that position. So, still moves the horse, which is stupid. This guy is going to try to move the queen. And finally this guy understands that this is not going to happen to me again. I'm going to counter this. So he moves the pawn over here, preventing the queen from doing a checkmate on him. Okay, so essentially, what's the idea here? Even though this guy has never played against this guy before in his life, he has used experience from a previous dialogue to prevent something from happening. He was able to strategize against this guy, even though he's never met this guy before. Yes?
Because I don't understand one thing. This is true that he kind of learned from
The previous dialogue, yes.
but this is one of very large amount of possible scenarios that he could find.
Yes, that's true.
So, and given that each of these, let's say, dialogues consists of multiple steps, how do we know that taking certain decision at some point?
We don't. And that's a very good question. I was trying to avoid getting into this kind of discussion because it's creating lots of problems, especially if you're doing a PhD and people question your research all the time. But it's a very good question. The thing is that a chess game is a perfect information game because you know all the moves that your opponents can actually do at every step. In contrast, in dialogues, you don't. Okay? What I'm trying to pass here is just the intuition, how we learn based on our experience. That's what I want you to keep. I understand that what your question is what you're asking is reasonable, but I'm just trying to convey the intuition now. Okay? And a good example that allows me to show you how the intuition works in my context is this. Assume, for example, that we have a dialogue between two agents, a blue one and a red one. Okay? In this case, the blue agent is saying A, red agent responds with B. I say C, he says D, I lose the game. Okay? And I go on, I'm the blue agent, I go on into another discussion, into another dialogue with a green agent. Okay, I say A, he says B, I say C. Should I or should I not expect that to some extent it is likely for this agent, the green agent, to know D, given that he has moved B against A, like someone else did before? I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm just saying, isn't it likely? What do you think? It's likely, right? How likely, we still don't know. But it is likely. So, what is the proposed methodology? Essentially, I rely on this hypothesis, okay? On the hypothesis that, based on the structure of the arguments and how they appear in dialogues, it is likely to expect that if you see a pattern of arguments appearing in a dialogue, you should expect that someone you are facing at the moment might be aware of additional arguments you found that others were using in the past. To what extent? We're going to investigate that in the next slides.
Can I ask a
But,
question?
yes,
Isn't it very similar to reinforcement learning? Like,
I wouldn't say it's not, but it's generally similar to every kind of context. You rely on probabilities and likelihoods for inferring something. Okay? So, what is the idea? I want to build what I call a relationships graph. That is a graph that associates opponent information, arguments that you have faced in dialogues by a variety of opponents in the past, and link them with directed arrows, okay, indicating some sort of a relationship between them. For example, that one argument will follow after the other. In the previous example that I showed you, one would expect that D will follow after B. So in that relationships graph that I'm talking about, you would find B, a direct arrow to D, implying that after B, it is likely that D will follow. Okay? Let me give you an actual example. Assume that we have two agents. That's me and Sanjay again. Sanjay is English Indian, so he likes Indian food. Okay, I'm Greek. Best food in the world is Greek. So you know that. Okay. And in order to decide we wanted to decide one night where to have dinner, and Sanjay obviously suggested that we go to the masala Indian restaurant, and I wanted to go against that. So I replied with saying, yeah, you know, why should we go there? And Sanjay said, well, because I read in today's newspaper that it was proposed by a famous chef. So I replied, is this chef's opinion trustworthy? I mean, yeah, I know a chef back in Cyprus, and yeah, he's the worst kind of chef ever. So Sanjay responded with saying, yes, I heard that he won the National Best Chef Award this year. I mean, he's my supervisor and he's studying implementation theory. I mean, no chances of me winning, actually. I tried to counter that as well with saying that Indian food is too oily, though, and that it's therefore not healthy. And he responded with saying that it's healthy as it's made of natural foods and fats. So I lost the dialogue and we went out on for dinner at the masala restaurant. Assume now that I want to go against another agent, Liz, she's my other supervisor, on the same topic, okay? Now what I want to stress here is the following. Assume that Liz at some point in the dialogue, she moves argument N. Okay, assume that for some reason we've reached this point. She's going to use argument N. Based on my experience with Sanjay, should I not, or should I expect that she might also be aware of Q? That's the newspaper article and the chef's qualifications. Okay, so you can see that there's some natural relationship based on the fact that if someone has read the newspaper article, probably they've also read of the information that has to do with the chef's qualifications. So it's reasonable to expect that they know that. Of course, this is characterized by some sort of contextual criteria, but put that aside. I'm just talking about the structure of the dialogue here, okay? And I'm just saying, this one is found on the same path in the dialogue tree. It follows N, and it kind of supports it. So I'm just saying, if Liz is going to use the N argument, then it's likely that she also knows Q. So I should account for it. This implies in the sense that consecutive arguments in a dialogue have some kind of a relationship. Particularly N and Q in this case, they share a support relationship because Q supports N against Z. How about N and S? Would you say that N and S should share a similar relationship? They don't. Why? Because they belong in different paths of the tree. Obviously, N supports X as well as S supports X, but they don't support each other. And since I rely on the support relationship for building this graph, I would be assuming that there is no relationship between N and S. We will assume that our hypothesis applies only for arguments asserted in the same branch of a dialogue tree. Okay? So, for building this relationships graph, we will be relying on this condition. Connected arguments must be in the same path of a dialogue tree. Okay? So they have to be in the same path of a dialogue tree. And no more than n levels distance from each other, disregarding our own argument. So for example, the distance between B and D would be just 1, as well as the distance between B and F would also be just 1. To give you an example of what this n means, let me show you this. Assume that we have a dialogue like this one. You could assume, based on the structure of this dialogue, that B is directly related with D, B is also directly related with F, and F with H. If N is set to 1, you cannot assume that B is related with H, even though they are found on the same path of the tree. Okay? So, for N equals 2 now, you would be able to do that. This modeling approach simply reflects the implied relationship that consecutive arguments have in the same path of the tree. And as you can understand, through modifying the n value, you can strengthen or weaken the connectivity between the relationship that the arguments have. Of course, if you think about it, imagine this path being really a huge path, extending really, really deep in the tree. And try to pass this into an actual dialogue. We can keep on extending that path, and at some point, even the topic is going to change. We could start talking about when the sun will cease to exist, and end up talking about whether God exists. So, if you increase the n, to some extent you're kind of missing the idea of the connection. So, the number of n is important in terms of the context. It's important in terms of the support relationship and how arguments interact. There's also an issue that has to do with the space that you have in your in your machines and whether you can actually keep on assuming that all arguments are related. And you cannot do this forever. So it's some sort of a limitation of the approach.
How about the paths? How do you choose the branches? I mean,
You don't choose the branches. Let me show you an example to understand exactly what's going on. Assume that I want to build this relationship graph. And this graph, bear in mind that it's going to be built incrementally. You begin with having nothing in your knowledge base. It's a separate thing, okay? And it's incrementally built as you encounter more and more opponents. So this is an example. I go across a red agent, okay? I go against a red agent. I've got B against A. C is my attack on B, countered by D. This is how the relationship graph is constructed. I came across B, I added it in my relationships graph. Then D followed B. There's an arrow that connects them. N is set to 1 now. I'm countering B with E. F follows, another connection. So, in a sense, what this tells me is that after B, it's likely for D or F to follow.
but I mean, this is just an artificial example, right? If you want to follow a real dialogue, how would you know in the middle whether that person is now attacking the main argument or whether this is a follow-up of the same attack that he had? And you know, how do you know when they change to attack the main argument again in a path?
You
That's-
just
you
know.
have to model
You
it.
just know all the arguments. I mean, you just know the arguments that your opponent knows. If those arguments can attack any of your arguments at any given point, you know that based on the structure of the arguments. Okay, and you just account for it in your strategizing.
So there are some
What I'm doing
models.
here is just I'm predicting that once I come across a B, generally, regardless of the opponent,
Okay.
it's likely, since that opponent knows B, he's likely to also know D and F. With some likelihood, we still don't know anything about that likelihood. I'm just showing you how this thing
So
can be
you're more
constructed.
focusing
If you-
on opponent modeling, not
Yes,
the modeling
yes.
of the actual dialogues.
Not the strategizing
Yes.
part.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Assume now that I'm going against another agent, green one, I'm saying G, he's saying I, I'm saying J, F now appears. Now, you must have followed this. Look, as soon as I come across I just add it, not being connected to the rest of the graph, okay? And then I attack it with J, it's supported by F. So this implies that after I, F might follow. That's how I got connected to the rest of the graph. So as you go against a number of agents, this graph is expanded. Okay? It's not necessarily coherent, but it's expanded. Okay? Now, what's the idea? Oh, yeah, I have to talk about this as well. This is not supposed to look like this. I don't know why it looks like this, but anyway. This is a formula that gives you the weight on one of the edges. Okay? That weight is exactly the answer to the question how likely it is for F to follow after B. Essentially what we're doing is this. We're just saying, assume that we have observed F following after B 10 times out of the total 20 times that B appeared in dialogues. The possibility of F following after B is 10 over 20. So that's 50%. Okay? That also relies on experience.
Isn't there a little bit more to it than that? Because surely the
It's
weight
trivial.
Shouldn't it be a function of what you counted with? So if you saw B and then you counted with another argument, I mean, if you didn't counter with the same argument every time, then surely you need...
There are lots of issues. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible because, to be honest, the formula I'm using for my calculations is a lot more complex than that. But I'm just saying that, just to give you the intuition, don't you find it reasonable? I'm just counting the times that B and F appeared and putting it against the total numbers of B appearing. So that, in a sense, tells me it is 50% likely that after a B, F will follow. That's what it tells me. And that's how you get a likelihood.
Do you count instances of the same person? Say you talk to the same person twice, and
Yeah, that's another smart thing. I'm accounting for that as well. In a sense, it doesn't make sense to count someone more than once. It has to be distinct dialogues with distinct agents and so on. So you have to account for all these things as well. The fact that you can understand these things means that you're getting what I'm presenting, which makes me feel glad. But yeah, I'm not explaining all this stuff because otherwise I'll be here for quite a huge amount of time. I'm going to talk about this now, the cold start problem. Obviously, if you just rely on two dialogues, for example, for building this relationships graph, then your likelihood values are not going to be really productive. They're not going to be smart. It's the same thing that you come across when you first create a Facebook account. Facebook is not smart with proposing friends, right? They don't know anything about you, so they don't know who is likely to be a friend. But as time passes by, as you add new people to your Facebook account, then Facebook becomes smarter as well. It becomes aware of new information, and it can decide on the different likelihoods of you knowing other people, and it suggests those people or pages or I don't know what to you, and it makes more sense. So we have the same problem here. We have to wait a little bit. We have to wait until an agent comes across an adequate number of agents in dialogues before these numbers, these weights, start making sense. Okay? So, this is not supposed to look like this, but I'm just trying to say how the idea works. Essentially, I've just explained how to build this relationships graph up to now. Okay? Now, how am I going to use this? Is this. Goes like this. Assume that I have the relationships graph. And this is something that I was able to incrementally build through a series of dialogues. Okay? Now I'm going to go against Sanjay, and I know that Sanjay knows B and I. That's why these two are yellow. Now, based on my relationships graph, I can assume that there's some likelihood that Sanjay knows D and F as well, given that they are attached to B and I. Okay, they are of one hop distance from these two. Essentially, I have four possible combinations of possible augmentations of the opponent model that I could do. I could either, I don't know why I say this, but anyway, I could either assume that my opponent model will remain as it is, just keep B and I, and not include anything. Or I could just include D in Sanjay's knowledge. That's my assumptions about what Sanjay knows. I could just include F, or I could include both. So for this trivial graph, I have four possible augmentations. Four possibilities of augmentations, and based on basic probability laws, if you add these four possibilities, they should give you one. They should all add to 100%. So what's the problem? The problem is that even for a simple graph like this one, the complexity is exponential. It's 2 to the power of 2. That is two neighbors attached to the opponent model, which is the yellow graphs. I just have two neighbors. Okay?
So this is still your relational graph. That's that one.
That's the relationships graph.
So and when you say opponent model, you mean what yellow?
Opponent model, I just mean the yellow nodes.
So
that is
that's
my assumption
what he knows.
of what my opponent knows based on my experience. So I know this stuff for sure.
So now you're trying to figure out whether you should
Add more things to it.
Yeah. So based on what you did before.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And what I'm saying is that he's likely to know these two, and the combinations of dialogue and a huge relationships graph, I mean, it would take you forever. And that's why we turn to Monte Carlo simulations. Are you aware with this? Are you aware of Monte Carlo simulations? I'm going to talk a little bit about these things. What you do with a Monte Carlo simulation is that you are running simulations many times over and over again in order to calculate these probabilities that I'm trying to calculate, but heuristically. This is less expensive. It makes your methodology tractable. And it's just like actually playing and recording your results in a real casino. That's where it got the name as well. I'm going to give you another simple example so that you understand how this is done. Assume, for example, that you want to experimentally compute this probability, the probability of getting a 5, for example, when you throw a die. What would you do? Wouldn't you just throw the die for an adequate number of times, record the number of times, and then compute the experimental probability? Assume, for example, that you want to compute the probability of getting a 5 when you throw a die. Experimentally do that, you could just say, okay, I'm going to throw the die for like 100 times. Once I throw it for 100 times, I can record how many times I got 5, say 17, and the probability of getting a 5 would be 17 out of 100. Right? So, after you do that, of course, you have to compute the experimental probability. Is that result a good result? What's the error between the actual probability? So, for deciding on whether your Monte Carlo simulation is good, then the approximation, it should be a good approximation of the theoretical probability. So you have to define an error value and see how much you're deviating from the actual theoretical values. You have to come up with a way of justifying that the number of times that you have repeated the experiment is good enough. And these are things that you have to prove, hard things, okay? And in that case, also prove that your solution, as an approximation, is acceptable. This is exactly what we did. We did just that. We developed an algorithm that randomly traverses the relationships graph. It begins from the yellow nodes, which are the things that we know our opponents believe, and randomly tries to get to either F and D. And I ran this thing like numerous times, every time recording the result. Then I count how many times I ended up at D, how many times I ended up at F, and I can, this way, compute an experimental probability of getting to D and F. Then I can simply define a threshold and say, if an argument is traversed more than, I don't know how much percent, then I will accept that argument as being part of my opponent's knowledge and include it in the opponent model. For example, if I say that the threshold is something like 60%, I run the experiment, I count that D was traversed something like 75%, then I will decide that D will be part of the opponent model, and when I strategize, I will also account for this possibility. That's what we did. Now,
how do you randomly traverse a graph?
it's a random walk. You simply assume a starting point. You assume that you are at a certain node, okay? And then what you do is the following. You just say, I have all these edges that lead to different nodes. Based on the weights that I just explained how we compute them, you randomly try to go through that edge with some probability. If you get a value that allows you to traverse that edge, then you get to the node, and you end the experiment, and you try again.
What do you mean with if you're... So it sounds like you might or might not be allowed.
Yeah, you might not.
Why might you not be allowed?
Because, as you recall, we also have to account for the possibility that you add nothing in your... Where is it?
Oh, right.
In this possibility, we add nothing in your opponent knowledge. So you have to account for that as well. It's a random walk, actually. You just start from somewhere and randomly end up somewhere else.
But so the decision to which node you go, is that based on the probability of the edges, or is that...
Yes, exactly. It's based on the probability of the edges. So we developed this Monte Carlo simulation. We actually did pretty good. You can see here a number of samples, how many times we repeat the experiment. That's, you can see here something like 100 times. And that's enough to show that in just 100 samples, the error levels were diminished to a number less than 0.1.
How did you calculate the errors?
You first compute the experimental probability based on this approach that I showed. Okay. So,
and you know for a fact what?
And yes, you have to also compute the theoretical probabilities. But that's for the sake of proving that the Monte Carlo approach is good.
Yes.
You don't really have to do it when you,
When you
rely on our
show
methodology.
So the theoretical probability in that case would be the one you showed at the beginning,
Yes,
like based on
which
the
you would have
edges.
to compute.
Right.
And which is, of course,
But then
much more
it seems
expensive.
like if you traverse the graph, is that, I mean, to me intuitively, that seems like so much more work than computing a few
It's not.
probabilities.
It's not, and I can explain it in the end of the talk because it gets very, very technical. But it's not. I'll explain why. So yeah, we got this experimental result. This is Yanis. This is my colleague. We wrote a paper together, and his knowledge and assistance has been invaluable. He's a graph expert, and he's taught me a lot of things. You can see here another graph. We've run various experiments with different graph sizes. This is a 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 nodes. And as you can see, we were able to keep the error level below a theoretical threshold, which is defined by the red line, and just proves that our approach is good. We were able to publish this work, HCAI, in China this summer. We also got a Best Poster award for this presentation. It was voted as the best poster out of 413 posters. And we had a really good time. That's Sanjay, that's Lee, that's me, that's Yanis. And that's all. Hope you liked it. Yeah. Any questions? Would you like me to go through that particular
Oh yeah,
example?
I mean, if no one else has questions, so I'm happy
I
to.
anticipated the question, and that's why I got this. I don't know why, but it doesn't show really well. Let me try and explain this. Assume that you want to compute the probability of simply including f, okay?
That's the theoretical problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would have to compute three things. The probability of including f is the probability of, as you know, the random walk thing. It accounts for the whether you would include an edge, actually. So you would have to say, it's the probability of including f, this edge, probability of including this edge, okay, plus the probability of including this edge, minus their joint outcome, okay, multiplied by the probability of not including d.
Oh right, yeah.
Okay, that's for just this trivial graph, okay, and for just a node that has two edges attached to it from the opponent model. I know this math doesn't really look good now.
I mean, okay, so I mean, the probabilities of the edges, you have them in both cases, right? No matter whether it's the theoretical
Yes.
or the Monte Carlo. So you need to compute them anyway. So we have them, and then it just seems like so if you compute the theoretical probability, it just seems like, well, you have all the values, so you just need to put them into your computer, and it just does all the pluses,
Yes, but we don't
minuses.
do that. We don't do that. We only compute the theoretical values to show that the Monte Carlo approach does well.
No, I know that, but so you're using the Monte Carlo because you say the other would be
More expensive.
exactly. But I don't. For me, it looks like, well, I mean, you have all the values. You just need to multiply them and plus or minus, and then I mean, computers are quickly calculating these things.
It's
Why
not.
is it so
It's expensive.
expensive?
Really. It's expensive. I mean, if you account for the fact that just for this trivial graph, imagine having a huge graph, okay, with a huge number of edges attacking f, for example, or being related with them. Because this is our relationship graph, okay? So it could be related with this. You could have something like 10 arguments being related to it. And at the same time, imagine that you would have not just one argument, which you wouldn't include, but like 10. So you'd have to compute the probability of not including this one, and the other one, and the other one, and the other one, and the other one, and the probability of including this edge, and the other edge, and the other edge, minus the joint outcome. I mean, the whole thing is like a huge...
So is it exponential in the number of nodes,
It is.
or roughly?
It is also. It's not exactly exponential, but our computer the complexity is near exponential.
Okay.
So is it just that it's expensive because you have to calculate all these things, or also because you have to jump from this to this to this? Is that
No,
all
it's
these-
not because of that. It's just because you have to calculate all these
Oh,
things.
right.
And at the same time, imagine how many different augmentations there would be. I mean, for just this trivial graph, I showed you this
Yeah.
2 to the power of 2. Imagine having something like 10 neighbors. It would be 2 to the power of 10 combinations.
So how many Monte Carlo simulations do you run?
The adequate number that we came up with is like 100. In 100 simulations, after you run the experiment for 100 times, then you're okay.
So it's not a function of your nodes, your number of arguments. I mean, the size of your argument.
It's just that the simulation works well because it can, well, obviously you're going to lose something. It's an approximation. You are not going to compute everything. But in
it's not-
terms
it's not
of
a
coming up
function
with
of
the arguments that are most likely to be known to your opponent, you will find those. There's a low probability that you'll lose the important ones, especially if you have a threshold that defines, restricts other arguments that don't satisfy the threshold to be part of the new opponent model. Yes?
You mentioned connectivity, like the distant function, like n for support
Yes.
or support of algorithms. Do you perhaps use that in like fixed or varied depth search, Monte Carlo simulation as well, or no?
Yeah, we do actually. It's the next step of mine. It's a more complex approach that we're investigating actually, and which I've finished now. Essentially, what we do is the following thing. You can assume that n is bigger. Okay, so in that case, the graph is much more dense, as you can understand. And if you make the graph more dense in that sense, then you have to do a much more simpler Monte Carlo simulation, because you just assume that you're expanding your opponent knowledge with just one hop away from you. But if you assume that n is very low, like 1, then it makes sense to expand your opponent model with more than one hops. Find neighbors of your neighbors and neighbors of those that might be related to you. And that means that you'll have to compute a propagated probability now, and it makes it a lot more complex, but it's also interesting.
So you're gonna like...
I've done this.
Okay.
I'm actually at the process of writing up my thesis now, and it's a chapter I'm trying to finish at the moment. Yes?
So does your choice of using Monte Carlo to calculate has anything to do with being easily paralyzed?
With?
Paralyzed calculations or the simulations?
Paralyzed in what sense?
Using Monte Carlo, because...
I'm just trying to find a tractable way of computing these probabilities. If I wasn't computing them in a tractable way, then this whole approach wouldn't be so effective and so efficient. You have to understand that this is something that you can use either on the fly during a dialogue or offline at the end of a game. Well, if it's offline, then you don't care about the time. But if you want to use it on the fly while you wait for your opponent to make his next move, or while he's waiting for you to make your next move, then you need to be quick. So you have to come up with a tractable way of using the new information you just gained, the fact that your opponent knows a new argument, in order to decide with which other arguments you've come across this new argument might be related with, and account for those. So you have to be quick. Yes?
We should try to use it in something like a chess game, if you are in chess.
I'm actually finding application of this methodology, which I think is something like a prediction mechanism, in recommender systems. For predicting whether someone might be interested in buying a product on Amazon, or find interest in some article and so on, as well as in bioinformatics. We were thinking about applying this relationships graph methodology for deciding whether certain amino acids might interact in order to produce a new protein. So yeah, but these are just draft ideas at the moment, though we can find many applications of this new thing.
So what about literature? Is there anything else in the literature, different approaches that you do better or worse than that?
To be honest, I haven't found anything similar to what I've done.
That's good.
There's much work on other things, especially when it comes to strategizing. But opponent modeling, in particular the way I'm doing it, is something that's left kind of implicit. I mean, opponent modeling in general is something that's left implicit. People just assume that, all the things that you can find out about your opponents are things you gain from experience, from interacting with them, or things that someone might let you know about. They don't take it to the next level. And that's what I've done, I think.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.